The sun over Pine Hollow showed no mercy. Ezekiel Freeman had been bent over the same row of peach trees since 5 in the morning, his faded shirt soaked through, his hands caked with red clay up to the wrists. He worked slowly, deliberately, the way a man works when he has something to hide. 2 women walking the road slowed down to watch him. "Look at that," one said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Grown man working another man's land. Pathetic," the other laughed. "Who's gonna marry someone like that? He can't even afford decent boots." Ezekiel didn't look up. He kept pulling weeds, jaw tight, eyes down. Let them talk. They had no idea the deed to every acre of this land had his name on it. They had no idea he'd chosen to stand here in borrowed poverty because he was tired of being loved for the wrong reasons. Then Naomi Bell crossed the road, held out a tin cup of cold water, and quietly crouched down to help him gather the peaches that had fallen. She didn't ask what he owned. She didn't ask what he was worth. What she didn't know was that her kindness was already being tested, and the man doing the testing was about to fall apart. If you love stories about real love, hidden truth, and second chances, subscribe to our channel. New stories drop every week, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Pine Hollow was the kind of town where everybody knew your name, your land, and exactly how much both were worth. Freeman Orchard stretched across the northeastern edge of the county. 200 acres of peach trees, a cornfield that ran to the tree line, a horse stable, a grain storage house, and a small mill that had been grinding flour for 3 generations. The Freeman name meant something in Pine Hollow. It meant money. It meant soil that had never gone to auction. It meant a family that had held on when every force around them said let go. Ezekiel Freeman was 37 years old and had inherited all of it, the land, the name, and the weight that came with both. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that told the truth about a person. Calloused, scarred in 3 places, stained with work that no amount of soap fully removed. He could have hired men to do everything. He often did. But there were mornings when Ezekiel needed to feel the soil between his fingers, needed the ache in his back at the end of a long day just to remember who he was before the land became a number on a county tax record. His wife Ruth had understood that about him. Ruth had been gone 4 years now, a fever that came fast and left faster, taking her before either of them had time to prepare. She left behind a daughter Lila, now 7 years old, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and a silence in the farmhouse that Ezekiel had never fully learned to fill. He had tried once to let someone else in. Marlene Carter was beautiful in the way that made people in small towns talk. She dressed well, spoke well, laughed at the right moments. For 3 months she had been kind to Lila, braiding her hair, bringing her small gifts, sitting beside her in the church pew on Sunday mornings. Ezekiel had believed it. He had wanted to believe it. Then one evening he came through the back door of his own kitchen and heard Marlene on the porch talking to a friend she'd invited over without asking. "I just need to get through the engagement," Marlene said. "Once I'm Mrs. Freeman, the rest takes care of itself." Ezekiel stood in that kitchen for a long time without moving. Then he set down his hat, walked back outside through the front door, and never brought up marriage again. He ended things quietly the way he did most things. But something in him had closed a door he wasn't sure he knew how to open. After that, he stopped trusting what he saw on the surface. Naomi Bell had arrived in Pine Hollow 6 weeks before the story began, and she had arrived quietly. She was 29, slight with close-cropped natural hair, and a way of moving that suggested she was used to taking up as little space as possible. She had rented the small wood frame house at the edge of the orchard property, a listing most people ignored because the porch leaned and the well pump required persuasion to be close to her Aunt Clara, who was ill and had no one else. Naomi had no history in Pine Hollow, which meant the town invented one for her. They said her father had burned down a grain storage house 15 years ago somewhere in the next county. They said the family had been running from that story ever since. They said a woman who came from that kind of shame couldn't be trusted, no matter how politely she nodded at you in the market. Naomi heard the whispers. She always had. She kept her head down, sold baked goods at the Saturday market, tended her small garden, and took care of her aunt without complaint. She believed her father was innocent. She had believed it her whole life. Alone. About Lionel. Lionel Freeman was 32, lean, and had managed the orchard's operations for 5 years. He had grown up in the shadow of the Freeman name without ever fully owning it, and he had learned to be useful as a substitute for being important. He was not a cruel man by nature. He was an envious one, which, given enough time and opportunity, amounts to the same thing. The idea came to Ezekiel on a Tuesday night, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a glass of water he hadn't touched and a stack of letters he hadn't opened. 3 of them were from women in town. Handwritten notes, carefully worded, arriving within a week of each other. One mentioned how much she admired the Freeman legacy. Another said she had always respected hard-working landowners. The third didn't bother with subtlety at all, and simply asked if he'd be attending the harvest social because she intended to be there and thought they might have a great deal in common. Ezekiel read all 3 letters. Then he folded them, set them at the edge of the table, and sat quietly for a long time. He thought about Ruth, about how she had fallen in love with him before the orchard turned a profit, back when Freeman land was more debt than asset, and the farmhouse roof leaked in 2 rooms. She had never once looked at him the way those letters felt, calculated, angled, already measuring the square footage of a life she wanted to step into. He thought about Lila asleep upstairs, who deserved better than a stepmother who was only counting acres. And then the way a man arrives at a foolish idea by convincing himself it's a reasonable one. Ezekiel made a decision. He called Lionel the next morning and said he needed to step away for a few weeks to handle business out of county. He asked Lionel to manage operations in his absence. Lionel agreed without hesitation, the way he always did, reliably, and with just enough eagerness to suggest he had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. What Ezekiel did not tell him was that he wasn't leaving at all. He moved into the old wood-frame cabin at the far end of the South Orchard, a structure that had served as field hand quarters decades ago and sat empty since. He wore old work clothes pulled from a box in the barn. He let his beard grow in. Marlene had known him clean-shaven, well-dressed, every inch the landowner. With 3 weeks of beard and borrowed boots, he was confident she wouldn't look twice at a man working the far rows. He told the few people who asked that he was a day laborer named Zeke, passing through looking for seasonal work after a bad harvest wiped out what little he'd had. Lila was sent to stay with Ezekiel's aunt in the next town for the first several days. He didn't want his daughter subjected to the kind of looks that followed a man the moment people decided he had no value. He felt the difference within 48 hours. Men who had shaken his hand at county meetings looked through him on the road. A woman at the feed store spoke to him slowly, as if poverty had affected his hearing. When he caught his hand on a rusted piece of fencing and stood bleeding quietly at the edge of the road, 3 people walked past without stopping. Ezekiel cleaned the wound himself with water from the cabin pump and said nothing. It was the following morning that Naomi came. He was in the south row pulling weeds from around the base of the younger trees when he heard footsteps on the dry grass behind him. He didn't turn around. He had stopped expecting anything good to come from footsteps. But then a tin cup appeared at the edge of his vision, held out by a steady hand. "You've been out here since before sunrise," Naomi said. It wasn't a question. "Drink something." He took the cup. When he finally looked up, she had already crouched down beside the nearest tree and begun gathering the fallen peaches from the ground, the ones too bruised to sell but too good to leave to rot. She didn't comment on his clothes. She didn't ask who he worked for. She just picked up peaches one by one and set them in the crate he'd left nearby. "Somebody should at least make jam out of these," she said half to herself. Ezekiel drank the water and watched her and didn't say a word. But something shifted in him, quiet, almost imperceptible, like the first crack in a wall that has been standing too long. Lila came back on a Thursday. Ezekiel had driven to his aunt's house after dark, loaded his daughter's small bag into the truck, and carried her back to the cabin while she slept against his shoulder. He laid her down on the narrow cot he'd set up near the window and sat on the floor beside her for a while in the dark. He had not fully considered what it would mean to bring a 7-year-old into a lie. By Friday morning, the town had noticed. People saw the little girl at the cabin window, saw her following Zeke through the orchard rows, and the story updated itself the way small-town stories do, instantly and without verification. Poor man, widower, dragging that child around with him while he scraped together day wages. A shame. Nobody offered to help. Naomi noticed Lila the way she noticed most things without announcement. She appeared at the cabin door that Saturday with a pot of soup, said Aunt Clara had made too much and it would only go to waste, and held it out with the same calm manner she'd offered the water 3 days before. Ezekiel stepped aside to let her in. Lila looked up from the floor where she'd been drawing and studied the stranger with the frank, unfiltered evaluation that only children attempt openly. "Your hair is pretty," Lila said. "So is yours. Who braids it for you?" "Daddy tries," Lila said in a tone that conveyed considerable diplomatic restraint. Naomi glanced at Ezekiel. He had the expression of a man who knew exactly how that sentence sounded and had no defense prepared. She pulled a comb from her jacket pocket and sat down on the floor across from Lila without being asked. "Come here then," she said. Ezekiel stood in his own kitchen and watched a woman he had known for less than a week sit cross-legged on the cabin floor, carefully sectioning his daughter's hair, humming something low and tuneless under her breath, while Lila sat perfectly still for the first time in recent memory. He turned to the stove and stirred the soup that didn't need stirring. Over the days that followed, Naomi became a quiet presence at the edge of their lives. She brought books for Lila, thin paperbacks with illustrations picked up at the church sale for $1 each. She showed Lila how to press wildflowers between the pages. When Lila developed a mild cough mid-week, Naomi arrived the next morning with honey and ginger and sat beside the cot reading aloud until the girl fell asleep. Ezekiel watched all of it. He watched the way Naomi never once looked around the cabin with an appraising eye, never asked about the orchard, never inquired about land or ownership. She seemed entirely uninterested in what he had. She was only ever responding to what was in front of her: a tired man, a small girl, a pot that needed filling. It was Lionel who broke the stillness. Word reached Ezekiel through Gerald, a field hand in his 70s who had worked Freeman Orchard for 2 decades and still addressed him as Mr. Freeman when no one was listening. Lionel had begun raising rent on the tenant parcels along the southern boundary. 3 families had already received notices. The 4th address on the list, Gerald told him, was the small wood frame house at the edge of the orchard property. Naomi's house. Ezekiel read the notice Gerald handed him and stood very still. He had 2 choices: step forward, now reveal himself, use his name, stop it immediately, or wait, document what Lionel was doing, and handle it properly when the time came. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment. But standing there with Gerald's weathered face watching him carefully, Ezekiel understood with a clarity that sat uncomfortably in his chest that he was also afraid. Afraid that if he told Naomi the truth now, he would never know whether what was growing between them was real. He chose to wait. It was the most selfish decision he had made in years. And somewhere in Pine Hollow, without knowing any of it, Naomi Bell was heating soup for his daughter and trusting a man whose name she didn't actually know. Living poor was not the same as understanding poverty. Ezekiel had known that intellectually, but understanding a thing from the outside and standing inside it were 2 entirely different experiences, and the weeks he spent as Zeke taught him things that no county ledger or tenant report ever had. The feed store overcharged him, not dramatically, just enough to be deniable. A few extra cents on a bag of seed, a slightly inflated price on a tool he needed. When he counted out exact change at the counter, the clerk watched his hands with open impatience. At the Saturday market, vendors turned their best produce toward customers who arrived in clean clothes. What reached Zeke was what was left: the slightly soft tomatoes, the onions beginning to spot. He ate simply, repaired the cabin roof himself with salvaged materials, working in the dark after Lila was asleep so she wouldn't worry about the leak over her cot. His back hurt in the mornings in a way it never had before. He noticed all of it. He filed it away. And he thought about the families on those tenant parcels, Gerald's cousins, the widow Mrs. Patton, the young couple with the new baby who had been living this way not for a few instructive weeks, but for years, while paying rent to a name that had his blood in it. The shame of that sat with him through the long afternoons. Naomi's life, he was learning, operated on a different kind of discipline entirely. She rose before dawn to bake 4 kinds of goods for the Saturday market wrapped in cloth and priced modestly because she knew her customers and she knew what they could spare. She tended her garden in the hour before visiting Aunt Clara. She kept her accounts in a small notebook, every expense recorded in careful handwriting because there was no margin for forgetting. She did all of this without performance, without the particular martyrdom that some people adopt when they want credit for their suffering. Naomi simply worked the way certain people work, as if the alternative had never seriously occurred to them. But the town did not extend her the dignity her work deserved. At the market, women stepped around her table without stopping. At church, the pew beside her was often the last to fill. The story of her father followed her everywhere, invisible and adhesive, coloring every interaction before she'd spoken a single word. She never complained about it within Ezekiel's hearing, but he watched it happen week after week, and the anger that built in him was quiet and thorough. It was on a Wednesday evening that the moment arrived he had not anticipated. He had come to return one of Lila's borrowed books and found Naomi on her porch sorting through papers with the focused stillness of someone trying not to panic. She was holding a document up to the fading light, reading it a second time as if the words might change. Then she set it face down on her knee and pressed her hand flat against it. The physical act of holding something still because your hands need somewhere to go. Ezekiel had done it himself 4 years ago in a hospital corridor. "Just paperwork," she said when she noticed him. But as she gathered the stack, he caught a glimpse of the document on top. A formal notice. Lionel's signature at the bottom. He said nothing. He handed her the book. He walked home in the dark and did not sleep. 2 days later, while watching Lila help Naomi stake tomato plants in the small garden, Naomi said something that stopped him mid-step. "I don't know who owns this land," she said, pressing a stake into the soil without looking up. "But whoever it is, they should know there's a man named Lionel Freeman making decisions that aren't his to make." Ezekiel stood at the garden's edge and said nothing. "You ever hear that name, Freeman?" "Once or twice," he said carefully. She held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to the tomatoes. But something in the pause told him she was a more careful observer than he had given her credit for. That evening, while tidying the cabin, he moved a folded document from the table to the shelf. A delivery receipt bearing the Freeman Orchard seal stamped in red that had arrived with a supply order earlier that week. He had been careless. He heard Naomi's footstep on the porch a second too late. She stepped through the open door and stopped. Her eyes went to the paper in his hand. The red seal was visible for exactly 2 seconds before he folded it and set it on the shelf. "What's that?" she asked. "Old paperwork from a job last season," he said. She looked at him carefully. Not suspiciously, not yet, but with the attention of someone storing information they don't yet know what to do with. "Okay," she said, but she didn't fully let it go. He could see it in the slight stillness that followed the way her eyes moved once more to the shelf before she changed the subject. The wall he was standing behind had just developed its first crack. The evenings were the hardest part to pretend through. A slow, steady rain moved through Pine Hollow on a Thursday evening in late September, and Naomi had been on her way back from Aunt Clara's when it opened up. She arrived at the cabin doorway with her jacket pulled over her head and water running off her elbows, and Ezekiel stepped aside without discussion. Lila was already at the table with a bowl of cornbread batter, attempting something ambitious for a 7-year-old working alone. And she greeted Naomi's arrival with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a child who has decided without consulting anyone that a person belongs in her life. They ate together under the sound of rain on the tin roof. The cornbread came out uneven but edible. Nobody suggested she leave. Nobody checked the time. After Lila was in bed, Ezekiel and Naomi sat on opposite ends of the narrow porch, the rain still falling softly beyond the overhang. They talked about small things at first: the garden, the fencing, the old pecan tree at the property line. And then gradually they talked about larger things. Naomi told him about her father, not the story the town told, but her version. A man who worked grain storage his entire adult life, who knew every family in their county by name, who had been inside that building 100 times, who had been the easiest person to blame when the fire investigators needed someone to blame because he was there, because he was black, because he had no lawyer and no leverage, and no one in a position of power who owed him anything. She told it without bitterness in her voice, which Ezekiel found more affecting than bitterness would have been. She had processed the anger long ago. What remained was something quieter, a determination to carry her father's name carefully, to not let the weight of it crush what he had actually been. Ezekiel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I believe you. You don't know enough to believe me." "I know enough," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Most people decide before I open my mouth." "I know," he said. "I've watched them do it." She turned to look at him more fully, the expression of someone recalibrating something, as if she had filed him under one category and was now considering whether that had been accurate. The night Lila had the nightmare was a Wednesday, 3 days after the rain. Ezekiel heard her from across the cabin, a sharp cry, then the particular silence of a child who has woken frightened and doesn't yet know where she is. He was on his feet before he was fully awake. But by the time he reached her cot, Naomi was already there. She had been returning a book left it on the porch step and heard Lila through the open window. She had come in without knocking. There had been no time for knocking and was sitting on the edge of the cot with Lila pressed against her side, one hand moving in slow circles on the girl's back. Ezekiel stood in the doorway. "She was calling for her mama," Naomi said quietly without looking up. It was not an accusation, it was simply the truth of what had happened, stated plainly so he could receive it. Lila's breathing was slowing. Her fingers were wrapped around Naomi's wrist in the urgent grip of a child anchoring herself to something solid. "Sometimes I miss her so much I forget how to breathe," Lila said, her voice thick and small. Naomi pulled her closer. "That's not forgetting," she said. "That's loving somebody. You can love her and still let somebody else sit beside you. Those two things don't fight each other." Ezekiel turned and walked back to the porch. He sat down on the step in the dark and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, and for the first time since Ruth died, he cried without making any sound at all, the kind of crying a man does when he has been holding something for so long that his arms simply give out. When Naomi came out a few minutes later, she sat beside him on the step without comment. She did not ask if he was all right. She simply sat there, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence in the cool night air, and looked out at the dark orchard with him in silence. It was the following morning that Ezekiel found the papers. He had been clearing the back shelf of the cabin, moving old field records that had been stored there before he moved in, when a folder slid out from behind a rusted tin box and fell open on the floor. Gerald had told him once that the foreman used the cabin to store operational paperwork during harvest season, some of it going back decades. Nobody had cleared the shelves properly in years. He almost left it. Then a date caught his eye, 15 years ago, and beneath the date a name he recognized. He sat on the cabin floor for 2 hours reading. The documents were incomplete partial insurance records, an internal memo from the county assessor's office, a handwritten ledger page that didn't match the official fire report timeline. But what they suggested, laid out in sequence, was damning. The fire had started in a section of the storage house that the official report said was empty. The insurance payout had gone to 2 parties, one of which was a holding company whose registered agent listed in faded ink at the bottom of a notarized form was a name Ezekiel knew. His hand was not entirely steady when he set the last page down. The name on that form connected the fraud directly to Lionel's father and to the father of Marlene Carter. The fire had not been accidental. It had been deliberate, and a man named Raymond Bell had spent 15 years carrying the blame for it because he was the easiest person to hand it to. Ezekiel sat in the cabin with that knowledge and understood that this was no longer a story about a man testing whether a woman loved him for himself. This was something older and uglier, a wrong, buried under 15 years of silence, and a woman who had spent her entire adult life paying the price for it. He thought about telling her that night. Then his phone rang, A call forwarded through the farmhouse line to his cell from Lionel, who reported smoothly that operations were running well, that he'd made some adjustments to the southern boundary leases, and that he'd taken the liberty of consulting with a county clerk about formalizing a few outstanding easements. Ezekiel said very little. He hung up and sat with the phone in his hand. The man covering up a 15-year-old crime was now formalizing paperwork on Freeman land. And Ezekiel was still hiding in a cabin at the edge of his own orchard, telling himself he needed more time. The truth was simpler and less comfortable. He was not ready for Naomi to look at him the way he knew she would look at him when she found out who he was. The eviction notice arrived on a Monday. Naomi found it folded under her front door when she came back from Aunt Clara's morning medication. She read it twice, looking for the part where it made sense. It didn't. The notice cited an outstanding debt on the lease, a sum she had never been told she owed, calculated from a clause she had never seen in any document she had signed. 10 days to vacate. She folded it along its original crease and went inside to sit with her aunt, who was having a good day and wanted to talk about a recipe she remembered from 40 years ago. Naomi listened and responded and kept her face arranged into something neutral because Clara did not need to carry this. That evening, she came to the cabin with the notice in her jacket pocket. She didn't show it to Ezekiel immediately. She sat on the porch step while Lila drew pictures inside, and she looked out at the orchard for a while. "I'm going to have to find somewhere else," she said, "for me and Clara." Ezekiel went very still. "What happened?" She handed him the notice. He read it without letting his expression change, though what he felt reading Lionel's signature at the bottom was something close to cold fury. "This debt isn't real," he said. "It has a signature and a county stamp on it. Real enough to put us out. You shouldn't have to leave." She looked at him with an expression that was not unkind, but was very direct. "Zeke, you're a day laborer with a 7-year-old and a cabin that leaks. I appreciate that you care, but this isn't something you can fix." She paused. "There are people who are born into situations where they have to hold themselves up. Waiting for someone else to do it just means falling further while you wait." He wanted to tell her then. The words were right there, organized, ready, true. But he looked at her face and saw something he recognized. The particular dignity of a person who has learned to need nothing from anyone, because needing things had only ever left them exposed. If he told her now, it would look like rescue. And rescue, he understood, was not what this woman needed from him. What she needed was the truth, and he kept choosing not to give it to her. Marlene Carter returned to Pine Hollow on a Friday afternoon. She had been gone since Ezekiel ended things between them, 3 years spent in a city 2 counties over from what he'd heard. She returned the way she'd always done everything, with presence and purpose, working the market crowd with the ease of someone who had rehearsed her re-entry. She found him at the edge of the market near the pecan vendor and stopped 3 feet in front of him. The beard had grown in fully now. The clothes were convincingly worn. But Marlene had spent enough time studying Ezekiel Freeman to know the architecture of him, the particular width of his shoulders, the way he held his jaw when he was choosing not to speak. No amount of old clothing changed those things. "Ezekiel Freeman," she said softly. "Isn't this something?" He said nothing. "Heard there was a man named Zeke working the South Orchard," she continued pleasantly. "I've been watching you talk to that Bell woman." "What do you want, Marlene?" "I want what I should have had the first time," she said. "Come back to the table with me properly, or I walk over to Naomi Bell's market stall right now and tell her everything. Who you are, what you've been doing, how long you've been doing it." Ezekiel looked at her for a long moment. "You'd do that," he said, not a question. "I'd do that," she confirmed pleasantly. He turned and walked away without answering, but he felt the clock that had been running quietly in the background suddenly become very loud. 3 days later, an old farmer named Gerald stopped Naomi at the edge of the market. Gerald was in his 70s, weathered down to the essentials. A man who chose his words the way other people chose tools. Only what was necessary, only what would hold. He looked at Naomi for a moment before he spoke. "You ever see a picture of the Freeman boy?" he asked. "The owner, Ezekiel." Naomi shook her head. "Never had a reason to." Gerald nodded slowly. He looked out toward the Orchard Road, the direction Zeke usually came from in the mornings, and something moved across his face. "Tall man," Gerald said. "Broad. Hands like he works his own land even though he don't have to." He paused. "Same kind of quiet." Then he shook his head as if dismissing the thought and walked on. Naomi stood at her market stall for a long time after he left. She looked down at her hands. She thought about a tin cup of water and a red seal on a document that had been folded away too quickly. She thought about how well she knew the feeling of something not adding up. That night she lay awake in the small house that someone was trying to take from her, and she turned the pieces over in the dark, and she almost had it almost fit the last edge into place. But she trusted what she felt when she was with him, and so she chose one last time not to push. It was the most expensive trust she had ever extended. The meeting was called for Sunday after service. Lionel had arranged it with the efficiency of a man who had been planning it for longer than the occasion required. He had spoken to the deacon, reserved the use of the churchyard, and sent word through the right channels so that by the time the congregation filed out into the late morning light, a crowd had already begun to gather near the oak tree at the yard's center. Ezekiel stood at the back of that crowd and watched his cousins set up. Lionel was dressed too well for a Sunday in Pine Hollow, the kind of careful dressing that signals a performance. He had brought documents in a leather folder and two men from the county clerk's office who stood slightly behind him with the uncomfortable posture of people who have been told their presence lends legitimacy to something they haven't fully examined. Marlene stood to the side, arms folded, watching the crowd fill in. When her eyes found Ezekiel at the back, she held his gaze for exactly 1 second. The message was clear. He had not answered her. Now she had answered for him. Naomi arrived late, coming from Aunt Clara's with a covered dish she had planned to leave at the fellowship hall. She stopped at the edge of the gathering and looked around with the cautious attention of someone who has learned that public gatherings in small towns do not always end the same way for everyone. Lionel began speaking. He was composed and measured his voice, carrying easily across the yard. He talked about the integrity of the Freeman land. He talked about community standards. He talked about how Pine Hollow had always protected its own, and how that protection required honesty about who belonged and who did not. Then he said Naomi Bell's name. The crowd shifted. Naomi went very still. Lionel produced documents from the leather folder records he claimed demonstrated that the Bell family had outstanding debts connected to the destruction of a Freeman-affiliated grain storage facility 15 years prior. He said the land Naomi currently occupied had been obtained under false pretenses. He said the eviction notice was a correction, a long overdue restoration of what was rightfully owed. He said it all calmly, in the reasonable tone of a man performing public service. What Lionel did not say, because he could not afford to say it, was that he had known about the real cause of the fire for years and had said nothing. He had not struck the match, but he had covered for the men who did and then built a career on top of that silence. Marlene stepped forward when he finished. "That woman has been making herself very comfortable," she said with a glance toward Naomi. "Playing house with a man who barely has wages to his name, helping with his little girl like she's auditioning for a role." She smiled. "I suppose when you've got nothing, attaching yourself to someone else's almost nothing looks like opportunity." Lila, standing beside Ezekiel, made a sound, not a word, just a small, wounded intake of breath. Ezekiel looked down at his daughter's face and saw something there he had not been willing to see until this exact moment. Lila was not surprised by what was happening. She was hurt. There was a difference, and it mattered, and he had let it get here. He moved before he had fully decided to move. The crowd parted as he walked through it, not because they recognized him, but because of the way he moved. The particular quality of a man who has stopped managing how he appears to other people. He stopped in front of Lionel. "That fire report is fraudulent," he said. His voice was level and clear. "The insurance documentation has been altered. The debt you're citing doesn't exist, and you know it doesn't exist because your father helped construct the paperwork that buried it." Lionel's composure shifted. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is Freeman business, and you are a day laborer." The family land belongs to the person whose name is on the deed. He reached into his shirt pocket and removed the folded ownership document he had been carrying for 3 days. He unfolded it and held it up long enough for the 2 county clerks to see it clearly. Then he removed the ring. His grandfather's ring, plain gold, worn on his right hand because his left still felt like Ruth's territory. "My name is Ezekiel Freeman," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry across the yard. "I own this land, every acre of it, and I am telling you that woman has never owed a single dollar to anyone standing in this yard." The churchyard went silent. Lionel's composure fractured at the edges. Not dramatically, but visibly, the way a man looks when the ground he was certain of moves beneath him. The 2 county clerks exchanged a look. Marlene's smile disappeared as cleanly as if someone had wiped it away. Lila pushed through the crowd and took her father's hand. Naomi had not moved. She stood at the edge of the gathering with the covered dish still in her hands, and she looked at Ezekiel Freeman, the man she knew, the man she had fed soup, the man whose daughter she had held through a nightmare, and she put the pieces together in the space of 10 seconds. The paperwork with the red seal, Gerald's careful description, the questions about land and leases that a day laborer had no reason to ask. The way he always seemed to know more than he said. She had almost known. She had chosen not to push. And now, standing in front of a churchyard full of people, she understood that the man who had listened to her talk about her father had known about the fire, about the documents, possibly about the fraud, and had said nothing. Not because he didn't care, because he was testing her. She set the covered dish down on the nearest flat surface. She looked at Ezekiel for a long moment, long enough that he stopped speaking long enough that the crowd felt the temperature of it. "I don't know," she said quietly, "if what I felt was real, or just something you needed it to be for your experiment." She walked through the crowd. People stepped aside. Ezekiel called her name once. She didn't stop. He found her that evening. The light inside the small house was on. He could see her moving past the window, the deliberate movement of a person who is packing, who has decided something, and is executing the decision before the feeling behind it can be argued with. He knocked. She opened the door and looked at him without surprise. She stepped back to let him in, not forgiveness, but the courtesy of a woman who intended to say what she had to say to his face. The room was half-ordered for leaving. A bag on the chair, Clara's medicines in a box on the table wrapped carefully in dish towels so nothing would break in transit. "Sit down," Naomi said. She remained standing. He sat. He told her everything, not the version edited for sympathy, the full account in the order it happened. Marlene's words overheard in his own kitchen, the decision to disappear into a borrowed identity because he no longer trusted what wealth attracted. Lila being sent away those first few days, the eviction notice he had read and said nothing about, the documents under the cabin shelf, the fraud connecting Lionel's father and Marlene's father to the fire that had destroyed her family's name. He told her he had known about her father's likely innocence for weeks and had not told her. He did not offer justifications in the telling. He laid it out the way you lay out evidence because she deserved to see the full shape of it and decide for herself what it meant. When he finished, the room was quiet. Naomi looked at the window. Outside, the orchard was dark. "I understand why a father would want to protect his child," she said finally. Her voice was even, which was more difficult to receive than anger would have been. "I understand being afraid that the next person is only there for what you have. I understand all of that." She paused. "But understanding why someone does a thing doesn't mean the thing didn't cost you." "I know," he said. "You made my kindness into a test," she said. "Every meal I brought, every time I sat with Lila, every conversation on that porch, you were evaluating me." She turned from the window to look at him. "I have spent my entire life being evaluated by people who had already decided who I was before I opened my mouth. I thought you were different, and you were just in a different direction." Ezekiel absorbed that without flinching. It was accurate. He had no argument against it. "My father's name has been wrong for 15 years, Naomi continued. 15 years of people looking at me the way they looked at me today in that churchyard, and I carried it because I had no proof and no power to make anyone listen. And the man sitting across from me had documents on a shelf that could have started to change that, and chose to wait. "Yes," Ezekiel said. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Because I needed you to know that I'm not here to ask you for anything," he said. "I came to tell you the truth because you deserved it weeks ago. Not because I want you to forgive me tonight. Not because I think explaining it makes it right." Naomi looked at him for a long time. From the back room came the soft sound of Clara shifting in her bed. Naomi glanced toward the hallway, then back at him. "Lila asked me not to go," she said. It was not an answer. It was information she was offering, and she was letting him decide what to do with it. Ezekiel nodded slowly. "She means it." "I know she does," Naomi said. "That's the part that makes this hard." She did not ask him to leave, but she did not ask him to stay. She sat down across from him at the small table with Clara's medicines between them, and the silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was more than most of what had passed between them in the previous weeks. It was the first true thing they had shared. Ezekiel filed the documents with the county courthouse on a Monday morning. He drove himself without a lawyer, without anyone watching. He carried the folder under his arm and set it on the clerk's desk and asked that it be entered into the official record and forwarded to the district attorney's office. The clerk looked at the name on the documents, then at Ezekiel, then back at the documents. "This implicates members of your own family," the clerk said. "Yes," Ezekiel said, "it does." He drove home and went back to work in the orchard. The investigation moved faster than Pine Hollow expected. Within 2 weeks, the district attorney's office had subpoenaed the original fire records, the insurance payout documentation, and the county assessor's files from 15 years prior. What they found was a picture that had been carefully obscured but never fully erased because the people who constructed the cover had believed correctly for 15 years that no one with access to the truth had any incentive to expose it. Lionel was charged with document fraud, coercive lease practices, and conspiracy to conceal evidence in a civil arson case. What Ezekiel had not expected was the phone call he received from Lionel 2 days after the arrest. Lionel called from his home. His voice was different from the composed tone he had used in the churchyard. It was the voice of a man who had been awake for 48 hours. "I didn't start the fire," Lionel said. "My father did. I was 17. I found out 2 years later when he was dying and needed to tell someone." A pause. "I should have come forward then." Ezekiel sat with the phone against his ear and said nothing for a long moment. "I know," he said finally. "I've been carrying it a long time," Lionel said. "So has she," Ezekiel said. "Her whole life." The line was quiet. Then Lionel said, "I'll tell them everything, all of it, whatever they need." Ezekiel said, "I know you will." He hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a while. He did not feel satisfaction. He felt the particular exhaustion of a wrong that has been running too long finally being asked to stop. Marlene, when the full story became public, did not fight it. She left Pine Hollow within a week, quietly, the way people leave when they know the town has already made up its mind about them. The formal exoneration of Raymond Bell was entered into the county record on a Friday in late October. The district attorney's office issued a public statement. The Pine Hollow Courier ran it on the front page with Raymond Bell's name spelled correctly in the headline. The following Sunday, the pastor at Pine Hollow Baptist read the statement aloud from the pulpit before the service began at Ezekiel's quiet request. Naomi was not in the church that morning. She heard about it from Clara, who had a good day and sat up in bed and held her niece's hand while she read it aloud from the newspaper. Clara had known Raymond Bell. She said his name twice after Naomi finished reading just to hear it said correctly. Then she folded the paper and asked for her tea. Naomi sat in the chair beside her aunt's bed for a long time after that. The feeling that moved through her was too large and too old for immediate tears. It needed room to settle before it could be fully felt. When the tears came, they came quietly, the way things come when they have been waited for a long time. Ezekiel did not contact Naomi during the weeks the investigation ran. He had meant what he said. He was not there to ask her for anything. He rebuilt what needed rebuilding inside his own house first. He met individually with each tenant family on the southern boundary parcels and voided the inflated lease agreements Lionel had constructed, replacing them with terms that reflected actual land value. He established a small emergency fund through the county agricultural office, administered by Gerald for families facing crop failure. He converted the old field hand cabin, the one where he had lived as Zeke, into a temporary shelter for displaced farming families with Gerald's wife overseeing the practical arrangements. He did these things without announcement. Pine Hollow noticed anyway because Pine Hollow always noticed. But the noticing had a different quality now, less the spectacle of a wealthy man performing generosity, more the recognition of a man settling accounts he had let run too long. In the weeks after the churchyard, Naomi did not leave Pine Hollow. Clara still needed care. She still baked for the Saturday market, still tended her garden, still moved through the town that had spent years looking at her sideways. But the way the town looked at her was changing, slowly, imperfectly, in the way things change in small places, but changing. She and Ezekiel did not speak much. They crossed paths at the market at the edge of the road near the well at the property line. He would look. She would not quite meet his eyes. Neither of them pushed. Lila was the one who kept moving toward Naomi the way children do when they have decided something is true regardless of what the adults around them are working out. She brought small things, a peach, a folded piece of paper with a drawing on it, a handful of wildflowers with the stems still damp. Naomi accepted all of it without turning the child away. One afternoon, Naomi read the public notice of her father's exoneration again, not from the newspaper, but from a formal copy that had been mailed to her directly from the county courthouse. She sat with it at her kitchen table while Clara slept in the back room, and she read her father's name in official print, cleared of the thing that had followed her family for 15 years. She thought about Ezekiel, who had taken those documents to the courthouse, knowing it would cost him something. Who had done it without being asked, without using it to negotiate her return, without making it into a gesture. He had simply done what was right, and left her alone to decide what she wanted to do with the rest. She thought about that for a long time. It was a Tuesday morning, 5 weeks after the churchyard, that Naomi appeared at the edge of the south orchard. Ezekiel was working the same row he had been working the morning she first brought him water. He saw her coming from a distance and kept working. He did not want her to feel the pressure of being watched approaching. She stopped at the row's edge. "Gerald told me what you did with the cabin," she said. He straightened. "It was sitting empty. He told me about the leases too, and the fund." "The fund was Gerald's idea," Ezekiel said. "I just signed the paperwork." Naomi looked at him with the expression he had come to recognize. The careful, precise attention of someone who does not accept the first answer if a more accurate one is available. "You did all of it before you knew if I was coming back," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the orchard rows. "I can't forget the lie quickly," she said. "I want you to know that going in. It's not something I can just decide not to feel." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to. But I watched what you did after," she said. "When it cost you something. When there was no audience and no reason except that it was right." She paused. "That part was real." "All of it was real," he said. "The lie was real too. I'm not asking you to weigh one against the other and come out even. I'm just asking if you're willing to start from here." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. The orchard was quiet around them, the late October light coming through the branches at a low angle, turning everything amber and unhurried. "From here," she said finally. "Yes." They did not rush. Through November and into winter, Ezekiel and Naomi moved toward each other the way the season moved gradually, without announcement, each day a little closer to something that felt like solid ground. They had meals together at the farmhouse, the three of them, Lila presiding over the table with the authority of a child who considers herself the primary architect of arrangements that the adults around her are only beginning to understand. They walked the orchard on Sunday afternoons. They talked, really talked the way they had on the porch in the rain, except now without the layer of performance underneath it. Without Zeke, without Mr. Freeman. Just Ezekiel and Naomi and the particular ease that comes when two people have already seen each other at their most exposed and decided to stay anyway. Clara improved through the winter steadily in the way that sometimes happens when a person's circumstances become less heavy. She liked Ezekiel, whom she called by his full name with a formality he found deeply respectful. She told him once while Naomi was in the kitchen that her niece had been carrying things alone for too long, and that she hoped he understood what that meant about what she needed from him. He said he was learning. Clara said that was the right answer. The proposal, when it came, did not look like a proposal. It was a Saturday in late February when the first of the peach trees were beginning to show the earliest suggestion of buds. Ezekiel had been out since early morning, and Naomi had brought Lila out to find him, ostensibly because Lila had insisted, and Naomi had run out of reasons to say, "Not yet." He led them to the far eastern edge of the orchard, to a tree that stood slightly apart from the others, older, broader. Through the trunk, its bark marked with a small carved initial that had grown indistinct with time. "Ruth planted this one," he said. "First season after we were married. She said she wanted something that would outlast both of us." Naomi stood beside him and looked at the tree. "She was right," Naomi said. "She usually was," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking you to replace her. Lila isn't asking that either. We're asking something different." Lila, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the walk, stepped forward. She was holding something in both hands, a small bracelet made from braided ribbon, pale yellow and white, the kind of careful handwork that takes a 7-year-old considerable effort and considerable time. She held it out to Naomi. "I made it myself," Lila said. "Daddy helped with the knot at the end because I couldn't get it right, but the rest is me." Naomi crouched down to Lila's level. She looked at the bracelet, then at the girl's face, earnest, hopeful, trying very hard not to show how much the answer mattered. "Would you want to be our family?" Lila asked. "Not instead of anybody, just also." Naomi took the bracelet. Her hands were steady, her eyes were not entirely dry. "Just also," she said. "Yes." She looked up at Ezekiel over Lila's head. He was watching her with an expression she had come to recognize over the winter, the one he wore when he was feeling something large and had decided not to manage it, just to let it be there on his face where she could see it. "I need it to start with truth," she said to him. "From here forward, whatever comes, truth first." "Truth first," he said. "Always." They were married in April when the peach trees were in full bloom. The ceremony was in the orchard, held on a Saturday morning, with the light coming through the branches and the smell of blossoms in the air. There were no formal invitations. Word moved through Pine Hollow the way word always moved, and people came because they wanted to, which was the only reason Ezekiel had ever wanted anyone to come to anything. Gerald stood at the front with the pastor. Clara sat in a chair they had carried out from the farmhouse, wrapped in a good wool shawl, watching with the satisfaction of a woman who has lived long enough to see a few things come right. The families from the southern boundary parcels were there, the ones who had received the corrected leases, the ones who had watched a man choose honesty over advantage. Mrs. Patton brought food. The young couple with the new baby brought the baby, who contributed to the ceremony in the traditional manner of babies at outdoor events. Lila wore her yellow ribbon bracelet and stood between her father and Naomi during the vows, holding one hand from each of them, which had not been rehearsed, but which no one suggested she stop doing. That evening, after the last guests had gone and Clara was resting, and Lila had fallen asleep on the farmhouse couch, still in her good dress, Ezekiel and Naomi sat on the porch in the dark. The orchard was quiet around them, the same orchard where he had bent over a row of peach trees in a faded shirt and let people believe whatever they wanted to believe about him. The same ground where she had crossed a road and held out a tin cup of water without asking what he was worth. "I keep thinking about that first morning," Naomi said. "So do I," he said. "I almost didn't come over," she said. "I thought he doesn't want a stranger's help. He'll think I'm being presumptuous." "What made you come anyway?" She was quiet for a moment. "You looked tired," she said. "Not poor tired, tired tired. The kind that doesn't have anything to do with money." She paused. I recognized it. Ezekiel looked out at the dark shapes of the peach trees. He had started this looking for a woman who would love him without the land. What he had found was something that required more from him than he had planned to give. The truth, the documents, the accounting, the long and uncomfortable work of being answerable. He had found a woman who loved him in spite of the lie, not because she had overlooked it, but because she had looked directly at it and at what came after, and decided that what came after was worth something. He had found a family assembled not from the absence of loss, but alongside it, with Ruth's tree at the eastern edge of the orchard, and a child who had braided ribbon with patient hands, and a woman who had carried her father's name carefully for 29 years, and was still somehow capable of trust. It was more than he deserved. He was going to spend the rest of his life being worthy of it anyway. Ezekiel started with a lie to find the truth. What he didn't expect was that the truth would cost him more than the lie ever did. Real love doesn't begin when everything is perfect. It begins when someone sees the worst of you and decides you're still worth showing up for. If that means something to you, subscribe. We tell stories like this every week.